Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots in Genealogy, and I'm here today with Professor Carla Simonini from Loyola University, Chicago, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Italian history back to when unification began and finished, and also why so many people from southern Italy came to America. So, welcome, Carla. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And this should be fun. A lot of people ask me all the time about what I know about Italian history, which isn't much. So hopefully we'll get some great insight from you.
Well, I should talk a little bit maybe about my specific background. I got my PhD in Italian studies, which was concentrated mostly on Italian literature. And then I ended up doing a dissertation that was very interdisciplinary, and I started looking at the Italian American experience, especially through literature. So I'm not a historian in particular, but I actually we have to start from Italian history in order to understand the Italian immigrant experience in the United States. So that's been my approach in my courses and in my research, looking at the periods in Italy that produced mass waves of immigration, what was going on there, and then what happened to those immigrants once they landed on American shores. So,
yeah, and we all know kind of, our family,
mhm.
what their experience was, but there were a lot of similarities and also a lot of differences between, why people came and why they settled in certain places
Yes.
and things like that.
Mhm.
So my first question is, what were the events that led up to the unification of Italy? We know that there were, all of these regions, all these cities, and all of these various areas. What brought that all together?
Well, Italian Risorgimento, which is the unification movement, is extremely complicated, and as I tell my students, very Italian. And here we have, the revolution of in 1776 in the United States, blah blah blah. Italy, actually, they talk about having three different wars of revolution that happened in different stages, and depending on who you talk to, the actual Risorgimento movement, some date it from 1815 all the way up until after World War I. So there's different periods in which Italy speaks about going into its becoming unified. But generally speaking, the official date that Italy recognizes and celebrates as unification is 1861. So if you think 1861, that's about the time that the United States was heading into the Civil War. So Italy, as a united nation, in a modern sense, has a very short history, shorter than the United States. Um, Generally speaking, they talk about 1815 as being a seminal year that set off the unification impetus. So in 1815, that was after Napoleon was kind of, his kicked out, and they had this thing called the Congress of Vienna, and more or less all the nations of Europe went back to the state they were in before the Napoleonic invasion. So you had the former monarchs taking back over, and basically uh, it was a restoration to pre-Napoleonic times. But there had been some things that I guess we could say were good that came out of the Napoleonic reign. One of them was that there were some constitutional rights that were guaranteed. And when the old monarchs came in, they were going back to more of a authoritative position, whereas all over Italy, there had been a taste of this sense of, well, we as people should have more rights. So there started to be movements for greater independence, and also the idea that Italy at the time, they called them staterelli. They were divided up into small states, but there were really 8 major ones. One of them was the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. There was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south that was under the Bourbon rule. Those were the 2 biggest ones. There were the Papal States under the Pope in the center. And then there were a series of small, they called them duchies. There was one in Lombardy and Venezia. There was the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And then there were duchies of Parma and Modena. So those were the major blocks there. And out of all of those, the only one that was under a monarch who was from the same territory, from the Italian territories, was the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. So that ended up becoming sort of the hegemony for the Risorgimento movement. They ended up Italy coming under Piedmont really was sort of became the central focus for the Risorgimento. But within that, there were a lot of different figures and different trends. I think many people have heard of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was the great war hero. There was Giuseppe Mazzini, who was a great thinker. He was the one who thought very intellectually about the need for Italian independence. And there was also a great statesman, Camillo Benso Conte di Cavour, who was basically the Secretary of State in the Kingdom of Sardinia under the House of Savoy. So these three men, who didn't necessarily even like each other and had conflicts over time, somehow managed to put together a system which led to the 1861 unification of Italy. So Giuseppe Garibaldi was very impressed with Mazzini's thinking. Mazzini was a great thinker. He always had these grandiose plans, and he set up these societies, one society in particular called the Giovani Italia, where people would get together and discuss, men would get together and discuss ideas of liberty and self-rule and things like that. And it set off certainly the spark of wanting to be under self-rule. And although he had grandiose ideas, he wasn't a very good tactician. And every single time he started to set off a movement, they failed. So these movements were called moti. Garibaldi, on the other hand, was a great, everyone seems to concur, was a great general. He knew how to fight war, and he had the greatest success. And Cavour was a diplomat, so he was aware of the realities of a new state needing to make alliances. And he would sometimes make alliances that would go against what Garibaldi wanted or what Mazzini wanted. But again, somehow the three of them came together, and in 1861 you had Garibaldi's famous moment where he had conquered all of southern Italy and advanced up to Naples, and he really wanted a true republic, not a monarchy. But he, I think at that point, understood what Cavour was looking for and handed over all the conquered territories to King Victor Emmanuel II, and that is the moment we consider Italian unity in 1861. Still, it wasn't complete. Rome was still under the control of the Pope, and Venice was still under Austria. So there was still more work to be done, and that didn't happen until later in the decades in the 1870s when Rome and Venice, and there was a whole bunch of complicated things that happened during that period. So that's kind of a quick and dirty overview of a very complicated and messy history that took place in phases over a long period of time. It saw Giuseppe Garibaldi and Mazzini at times had bounties on their heads and had to flee the countries, had to flee the Italian territories because they were wanted. And the great enemy during this whole period, even though there were different alliances, it was this sense of Austria. So when you talk about Lombardy, Venezia, they were under Austrian rule, and all those duchies were not directly under Austrian rule, but they were allied with it. So the big enemy was Austria. So it was Italy, this nascent sense of Italianness, trying to push out the foreign rule that was Austria, either directly or indirectly. And in the south, the Bourbon states, which were Spanish rule, was the House of Bourbon from Spain.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. So I have to ask you if you know, because my grandmother comes from two noble families, Piromallo and Caracciolo, and they were obviously involved in that whole nobility thing when all this was happening. And I do know, because I found it in a couple of books, that my second great-grandfather was in the Neapolitan army at the time, and his wife's father was actually from Switzerland, and he was a captain in the Swiss Guard, assigned to the Neapolitan Army, which I had never had a clue. So when all of this was happening with these nobles, and especially the ones that were in the various armies from these states, how did it all play out? I mean, did they just have one big fight, or did they kind of just go along with the flow?
It depends where. I mean, obviously, the monarchs were vested in maintaining control. So you did have concessions being made. So at first, when, like in the House of Bourbon, they made some concessions. They said, okay, well, we'll make a parliamentary monarchy. We'll have a constitution in place. We'll try to appease the people that way. And that happened even up in Savoy, the House of Savoy. And sometimes it wasn't enough, and sometimes there were uprisings against that. But it depended where you were. But certainly the monarchies were very much vested in staying in control. And there were, there's a very famous novel. I don't know if you've read it, Il Gattopardo, The Leopard. It's set down in Sicily. It was written in the early 20th century, but the author Lampedusa was looking at his own family history and how he descended from nobility in Sicily, loyal to the House of Bourbon. And while this was happening, how there was sort of a pragmatic positioning of yourself so that you can still come out well despite what's going on. So there's a famous quote from that: in order for things to remain the same, everything must change. So it tracks the story of a young man who is of aristocratic descent actually joining forces, first with Garibaldi and later with the new government, and how to this is happening, let's make sure we position ourselves so we come out on top regardless of who's in charge, sort of thing. So you do hear stories like that throughout this history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I often wondered why my grandmother came to this country, because there are no pure Malos other than one that I found in the United States. And as it turned out, of course she was a girl, and her father wasn't in the direct line. So, he's not titled or anything like that. But I found that her aunt came to the United States in 1905. And what I recently found out from, a fourth cousin of mine, that we discovered each other after many, many years of our families knowing each other, that her great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather was fairly well off in Italy, and he came to America and started a shoe factory.
Oh, yeah, that's
and so piecing things together, I said, well, that must be why my grandmother came, even though her family was well off. My grandfather, while he wasn't noble, but they were fairly well off. They were lawyers and pharmacists, and so they weren't poor. But I'm only guessing here is that my grandmother's aunt must have said, "Come to America. There'll be opportunity here for your husband and everything," and that's how we wound up here. So, from my father's family, three of my oldest aunts and uncles were born in Italy, and my father and one of the younger girls were born here. But so that kind of segues into, I've heard that, and from what I've read, that the North kind of took over the South in all of this, that the South was relatively, I wouldn't say wealthy, but they were the breadbasket of Italy, and they were doing fairly well until unification. So is that true?
Well, that's very controversial right now in Italy. There's actually a movement called neo-Bourbonism. Like, so these people that are hearkening back to the reign of the Bourbons as sort of like some criticize it. They say it's revisionist history. You're looking back and rewriting things because there was certainly La Questione Meridionale, which became a term coined after Italian unification. It literally means the Southern question. So, yeah, there were differences between the North and the South. In general, up north, especially under Austria, but also in the reign of Savoy there was greater industrialization. The greatest for an example, the railroad, the biggest expanse of railroad was up in that area there. Also, they were more closely allied with European trends in political thought and governance, again, because of the influence of Austria and just geographically being closer up there, which is not to say that the South didn't have, a functioning economy, whatnot. One of the big things that happened after unification is they needed to create Italy. In fact, there's D'Azeglio, who's one of the great Italian statesmen. The quote is something along the lines of, well, now that we've made Italy, we have to make the Italians. So like, who are we as a people? So now we're a geographic entity. Who are we? Because there were cultural differences. There were linguistic differences. So you had this process of trying to figure out who we are as a united nation. To give you an example with linguistically, Tuscan was chosen as the dialect that was going to be the official language. At the time of unification, only 5% of the people who were considered now Italians actually spoke Tuscan as their primary language. So you had this huge linguistic divide. The other problem was with literacy. Italy had a high illiteracy rate, much higher than any other of the nations in Europe, and it was particularly bad in the south. Under the Bourbon rule, the peasants didn't have access to schooling, so Italy as a whole had an illiteracy rate of about 70 to 75% of the people could not read and write, and in the south, it was as high as between 80 and 90%. So they had this disparity between north and south in terms of language, in terms of literacy. And so the other thing was like, okay, we have to get united and we have to do it quickly. There had been some proposals of creating more like a federalist state, which probably in retrospect might have been a better idea, something like we have in the United States, where you have different federal governments that could have tended to the specific needs of the regions. But for efficiency regions, the new government opted for a strong central state. It was faster, it was easier. So where was the best equipped place to do that? It came out of the Piedmont region. So what happened was what they call a Piedmontization of the entire newly united Italy, because that was the place that had the civic, judicial systems best in place. They took the Piedmont model and they imposed it on all of Italy, which was not as good a fit for part of southern Italy. So that was part of it. It was a decision based on efficiency, but it had ramifications. And there was something also, they had to pay off the war debt. So and where did they get the money from? This is one thing that the South brings up all the time. The Bourbons had rich coffers down in the South, and it is true that some of that money was taken to pay off the debt. But the counter argument is that, well, we're a newly united nation. We need to draw our resources from where they come, and this is for the benefit of all to get the war debt paid down. So all those things happened. And then a few things happened that were particularly damaging to the South. Agriculture. Italy was mostly an agricultural country, north and south. The difference in the south under the Bourbon rule was that they had, they called them the latifondi. So the system of agriculture in the south was much more backwards than it was in the north. The latifondi were large, generally absentee landowners, and they lived off the toil of the peasants. And they didn't have any incentive to invest back in the land. As long as they had peasants that they could exploit and would work for them, all they did was have them work, and they took whatever fruits of their labor that they could manage. So that system broke down. And the new government also needed armed forces. And again, it needed money to invest in agriculture, not in agriculture, but in infrastructure. So what do? They have a obligatory military service for young men and a tax on what they called it the macinato, or it was called the bread tax. These were two especially hated, really detested taxes because they disproportionately hurt the people in the South. So under the Bourbon rule, military service was optional. If you wanted to become a soldier, you went and did it. Now, all of a sudden, these people are being told that their young men have to do, it was a lot, and it was like 5 years military service, and they were sent to some other part of Italy, which would have been like going to the moon for some of these families. And you took your young, able-bodied men from the family that could have been workers helping support the family are suddenly being taken by this government someplace strange where you don't know why. The other thing, the tax on the bread in the South, when you relied mostly on bread and pasta as your main means of food, that was extremely oppressive. Suddenly you're being taxed on your very nourishment. So this led to some disappointment. The other thing is that Garibaldi came down there as a populist figure, and they thought that he had great support when he first came down. He came down with this Spedizione dei Mille. He took 1,000 men. This is famous story in Italian history. Garibaldi marched down into Sicily with only 1,000 volunteers and took down this great Bourbon army, and went all the way, marched all the way up to Naples. And he was met with great fanfare because they thought, this is going to get better for us peasants. This is great. And then instead he hands it over to the monarch, and they find themselves shortly thereafter in conditions which they felt were worse than they were in before. So there was resentment on the population, on the peasant population. And this led to the period of the brigantaggio, or brigands or bandits. And that was a period it went on. There are vestiges of this that still exist to this day, but there was a period of basically, we would call it almost like guerrilla warfare, like uprisings against what was going on locally. And who were these brigands? They were a combination. Some of them were like bandits, bad guys that had been out there. There had always been road bandits and things like that. Some of them were people who were still loyal to the Bourbons that had gone in exile. Some of them were they're former soldiers from the Bourbon army who didn't have a job anymore. Nobody, they were displaced. Some of them were small property owners who felt like they were on the short end. Some of them were the peasants that didn't have anything. Some of them were the draft dodgers, these guys who didn't want to go off and serve in this army. And it got and then they were supported. The Bourbons in exile, they thought, hey, this is great. Let's keep this. We'd like to get back in power. This is a way if we can spread discord. And also the Papal States were known to have financially and in other means supported them because they too were vested in maintaining their own power. So you had a period there, good 4 or 5 years, where these uprisings were going on, and the newly formed Italian state didn't know what to do about it. So what did they do? They repressed them with very violent means and without much due process. I mean, they literally went down and held executions. They were known for going into towns that might have been harboring bandits and even killing women and children. It was so the repression on the part of the government in attempts to control the South, resulted in further worsening of the condition and discord amongst the population. And this led also to prejudice. There was this idea, well, there must be something wrong with these Southern people. They must be inherently criminal and this and that. And, vestiges of this are still heard in Italian society to this day, this Southern question and what happened there. So that's some of the historical pieces that went into that.
Yeah, and I find that fascinating, especially about, the serf part and all of that, because again, my grandmother's specifically her mother's family, but also her father's family. I know that my third great grandfather, he was the Count of Montebello, but he lived in Naples.
Oh, sure, that's very typical. Yeah,
and
yeah. You didn't see the signore. He came in when it was time to collect the money,
exactly,
or anything like that. Yeah. So, and like the Neo-Bourbons, they say, well, the system did function. There was, they talk about maybe there was less hunger. Hunger was a huge factor in spurring the emigration. That people simply, quite literally, did not have enough to eat. So the thought is, well, they had to have had enough to eat somehow under this system of absentee landlords, not that it was perfect. So when you hear about the Neo-Bourbonism, these are the types of things they bring up.
Yeah, and my mom's family, they're from Torito in Bari, and they actually, when my grandparents came in 1914, they came because my grandfather had served in the war in Libya, and World War I was on the horizon, and my grandmother said, you're not going to fight in another war, so they came to America. But they left their oldest son behind with his grandparents. And he didn't come until after World War II with his whole family. And so the stories I got from them are exactly what you're saying. In the 20s and 30s, very, very poor. However, my great grandfather, and this is a funny story, he owned a cow.
Well,
And
yeah,
he
that
would
was a
go,
big deal.
yeah, and he would go
Yeah.
door to door with the cow with my
Yeah.
uncle.
Mhm.
And that was the milk delivery system in
Yeah.
Torito.
Yeah. Well, I talk to this about my students too. Like the class distinctions were much more finely drawn in Italy than anything we've ever experienced in the United States. So they say the peasant class, but even within the peasant class, the fact that he owned a cow would have set him, would apart from somebody who owned, nothing, or you might have owned a small plot of land, or you would have been a piccolo terriero. So there were all these little distinctions that had to do with property. Property and landowning was a means of distinguishing yourself socially in Italian society at that time. And that's why I think Italians were, of all backgrounds, home ownership, owning something here was a major means of making it. This was a mark of having achieved something, that you owned something. You had a piece of land, a home of your own.
Yeah, and that's what my cousin actually told me that. They owned a home. It was 2 rooms.
Yep.
There was a bedroom, and then the everything else room, the kids' room, the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, everything else with the fireplace with the pot hanging over it. And again, this is in the 30s and 40s. But she even said that we were better off than most because we actually had a home.
You owned your own home.
Yeah. And but to your point about the classes, my cousin had interviewed his father in Barres before my uncle died. And in that interview, my uncle wanted to marry a woman who eventually became my aunt. But she was a rung above him.
Yes.
And even though they owned
a big deal.
Yeah. And even though they owned the home and they had the cow and everything, whatever her parents had was a little bit more. So, but he went in the army and came back, and eventually they allowed him to get married. Otherwise, my cousins wouldn't be here.
You hear about that too in my family and my grandmother's generation too. There was this sense of they knew what your status had been in the old country, and that could affect your marital choices here. My grandfather on my father's side, my Tuscan side, the Simoninis, their family was considered benestante. They were well off. Even in the States, he was a banker and whatnot. And the story is he dated my grandmother for like years. And he was in his 40s when he finally married her. And it was only after his parents passed away. So there is this sense that he had to wait until they weren't alive anymore so that he could marry a woman who was ostensibly, beneath him in stature, even though her family had come from a small landowning background as well. But yeah.
Well, my dad's father, he was actually in the seminary. And the story I always heard growing up, although I didn't know my grandfather, he passed away before I was born, but the story that they used to tell was that he would say that my grandmother would come past and flirt with him. And that's why he left. But then I found out the real story was her fancy carriage broke down in front of the seminary, and he was outside waiting, or just hanging out, whatever.
Yeah.
He helped them to fix the carriage. They gave him a ride someplace, and the rest is history. So with all of that seems to be the whole reason that you had these mass migrations out of specifically the South to the U.S. and to other countries.
Yeah, there were different waves of emigration if we're talking about the leaving there. So, I mean, like the first group, when these moti I was talking about before, these uprisings towards Italian independence started taking place in 1848, there was one where they actually established a republic in Rome, which was later suppressed. And that's when Garibaldi and others went into exile. But so you have your first group of immigrants coming to the United States as political exiles in this period, because they were the ones who were pushing for Italian unification, and they were, like I said, they had bounties on their heads in Italy. So you still the earliest groups you see in the United States. I mean, obviously there were Italians in the United States all the way back to its founding, even colonial times. But the first group you see coming over was that a lot of these political escapees, people who were looking asylum there. They tended to be more from the north, tended to be better educated. Obviously, they were politically engaged. After that, when you see the post Risorgimento era, that's when you started to have these conditions worsening in the South and you start seeing mass migration. The first destination that they went to was South America before you saw them coming to the United States. And that's why to this day, Argentina has a immense population that derives from Italian immigration during uh, the 19th century there. So there would be Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil also. Then around 1880, you start to see more coming in to the United States. And usually between 1880 and 1920, really up until 1924, when the Johnson-Reed bill was passed that really slammed the door shut on immigration, that's when you see the great waves coming from Italy to the United States. And in that period, about, again, the statistics vary, but it seems to be roughly between 75 and 80% of those people came from the regions east and south of Rome. But there were Italians from all over the peninsula that came here. Again, statistics can be misleading. The majority you could say were from the South, and the majority you could say were from the more humble classes, but not all of them, just like your own family story shows. So.
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
So my last question is about these regions. Basically Sicily, and we know Puglia. A lot of people came from there, and Campania. When they came to the United States, did they come to places that were either they thought were maybe similar to where they came from in Italy? Did they go to places because the industry was similar to what they may have done in Italy? Or did they just come as people started coming and they said, hey, we live in Corona, Queens, like my family, come here because it's nice?
Yeah. Well, all of the above. All of the above. It depends. One figure that I always tell my students that they're surprised about is that, the mythology is, they left for the new world looking for a better life. And, yes and no. The Italians they were known as birds of passage, more so than any other immigrant group. And that was because at least originally, men would come over by themselves more often than would then bring their families. And the idea was to work, make money, and go back to Italy and buy land. So even though the Italians were represented in one of the greatest numbers numerically during the Great Wave of 1880 to 1920, they also had the highest repatriation rate. So you had many of them that didn't stay. So in the beginning parts, especially, you'd have single men that would come over, and they were generally brought over by what was called the Padrone system. And this was an intermediary who worked for companies like railroads or mines or construction sites or wherever they needed able-bodied workers. And the Padrone would be sort of a middleman. They would oftentimes put up the money for the person's travel over to the United States and then set them up in work camps and help them find their way. Now, the Padrone system has gotten a lot of bad press because there were widespread abuses in it, to the point where it was abolished. When immigrants would come over, they'd have to deny that they had an existing work contract, which seems a little counterintuitive, but it was because of these people were being brought in. They couldn't pay off the debt for the journey, and then they were indebted to the company store that they were forced to buy all their goods from. So there was definitely some abuses in it. On the other hand, it did function in a certain extent in allowing people who wouldn't have otherwise had the means to get over here to get over. And there were some quote unquote good padroni. So those were the men that would come over generally for manual labor jobs. And no, it wasn't exactly the same thing they did in Italy, but they were manual laborers in Italy too. They would have been the braccianti, the people who worked the land. So it wasn't too far to go from, a pick and axe on the fields to one in a construction site digging, or on a railroad, or in a coal mine, or something like that. Later, you had them come over, with their wives, and they would begin to settle. There were some people that did look to regions of Italy that were like their own. There's a famous story. Mari Tomasi is an author from Vermont who published some works in the 1940s that talked about the Barry, Vermont stoneworkers. And they came over from the Piedmont region of Italy. And if you look side by side at a picture of the region in Italy they came from in Piedmont and what Barry, Vermont looks like, very, very similar geographically. So they certainly found an area that was comfortable for them in that area. And then they had the skills as stone cutters and carvers, sculptors, and things like that. And then there also was chain migration. That was very popular. So after these initial men came over and started working, some of them decided to stay. They would call for their wives if they had them. Oftentimes, if they were single men, they'd go back to Italy and find a wife and then bring the wife back. And so once you had communities established, you had this chain migration. They would support and help each other. And that's when the system of godparentage became even more important in the United States than it was in Italy. So we call them the comare, compari. These were your godparents. They weren't relatives by blood necessarily, but you would pick someone to baptize your child who would extend your sphere of influence. Usually you would want somebody who was maybe a little higher social status than you or whatnot. And there was a reciprocal obligation and respect between a godparent and a godchild. In the United States, that became even more important. So what would have been more like a family circle in Italy became more a town circle. So your godparentage extended. That's why we talk about my paesani here in the United States. It was your paesani were your people, in the sense of the village that you had a connection to in Italy that you recreated those bonds in the United States. So there's whole communities. I know Roseto. Pennsylvania, very, very famous settlement, which has been studied for the Rosetto effect, how people lived longer there and had low heart disease. They all came from the same town in Puglia. And like you said, in different areas, you find people that, you find these little societies, the Bagnoli Society or the Pico Society in different places. And these are the people from the same town that came over and settled in a different area. And so a little of all of that happened, a little of all of that.
And when my uncle finally came, they were going to come with the whole family, and I think there's 7, but one of my cousins, one of my female cousins, had a liver disease, and she got sick, and she couldn't. They couldn't leave, and I guess what happened was they didn't have the money to come over. But anyway, one of the Padrones came over. And they couldn't come to the U.S. first. They had to go to Canada right after the war. He had to go to Canada. They spent about 5 years there.
Yeah, after 1924, it was very hard to get into the United States. And you do see people going through Canada first. Yeah.
Right. And even though his whole family was here.
Yeah.
And his brothers, he had 5 brothers, and they all fought in World War II. He still had to go to Canada first. And but he came over, and he was at sea for like 40 days, some crazy thing. When he got to Canada, his visa had gone, wasn't good anymore, wasn't valid anymore. So they had to check them all out. And he was working on a mushroom farm.
Oh.
And imagine that.
That's the first. I haven't heard about Italian workers on mushroom farms before. So,
so eventually he sent for his eldest daughter. She came over, and she was miserable. She was in a boarding home with all men, even though her father was there, but she was in a boarding home with all men. And
very, very typical living situation, by the way, for the early immigrants. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what happened was, and you'll love this story, because my mother's sister and her husband went up to visit my uncle and my cousin in Toronto, or somewhere in Canada, or I think it was very close to the border. In any event, my cousin was 18. She was miserable. She was very unhappy. And my uncle said, "You can't stay here. Come with us." So they rigged up the back seat of the car so she could get underneath and they wouldn't see her as she drove across the border.
What year was that?
This
what
was
year?
probably about 49 or 50.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So eventually she
Yeah.
met her future husband here, but she couldn't get married.
Oh.
So they had to sneak her back to Canada. So she could become legal and come back. And actually they got married there and then they eventually came back. But
Wow. Yeah.
my uncle was, when they brought her back, they went back with my uncle and my aunt and my youngest cousin from that family, and my cousin and her husband to be, and they had to teach her to say, when they asked her, "Where are you from?" They had to teach her to say New York without trying to have a real Italian accent.
Oh gosh.
But she eventually came back, and everything was great.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I love this. This is one of the best ones I did. I enjoyed so much getting the history, and I know so many people have asked me about it, and I know we've only touched the surface. But for anyone who wants to learn more, what books or what would you recommend that they look at to try and get more of a background?
I think the best book that you can read is the one I was talking about before, The Leopard by Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa. I mean, that really brings to light the struggle of this aristocratic family going through the transition from being under the Bourbon rule through the Risorgimento, and how what happens to them across the generations there. It's a very, very powerful novel. I definitely recommend that. There are a lot of just simple websites out there you can be. I mean, the Risorgimento is very complicated. I hope I did, well enough just kind of summarizing some of the high points, but it was a long, drawn out movement that had a lot of different players in it. So yeah, look up things on those three figures. I'd say Mazzini, Garibaldi, and Cavour. I think if you look up a little bit about those three guys, you'll have more of a sense of what happened in there. So yeah.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.